Have you heard of Harriet Tubman?
Yes, she was a woman who helped many slaves escape.
She was kind of a heroine.
Exactly. Harriet was born in Maryland, United States around year 1822. She was a slave, but when she was almost 30 years old, she managed to escape to freedom. However, the most amazing thing was not her escape, but her return. Not once, not twice, but she returned at least 13 times, risking her life in order to lead more than 300 slaves to freedom. How did she do it? By using a secret network of routes and safe houses known as the Underground Railroad. It wasn't a real train, but an underground system organized by people who believed in freedom. Harriet was like a driver on that invisible railroad, traveling at night, orienting herself at the stars, praying all the way. They called her Moses because, like the biblical leader, she led her people to the promised land. Harriet had no army, no titles, no human power. She had faith, courage, and a mission. And in the Bible, we also find women of that kind. Sabbath School Like presents the series How to Study Biblical Prophecy. Lesson 11, Ruth and Esther. Contrary to what many people think, the Bible is not a sexist book. And it is not for a simple reason. God is not a sexist God. Several times, God used courageous women to change the course of history. This week, in the School of the Prophets 2.0, we are going to discover the prophetic power of two female stories. Women who had neither a throne nor a sword, but with their decision and faithfulness, they set forth the destiny of God's people. So the question is, what do Ruth and Esther teach us about God's prophetic plan and His special way of using those who trust in Him? First, God redeems out of love. Have you had difficult times?
Yes, when they put a cast on my leg.
When I had a tooth pulled without anesthesia.
Well, when you go through times like this, remember the story of Naomi and Ruth. Naomi and her husband, Elimelech, lived in Bethlehem, the city where Jesus would be born centuries later. Do you know what Bethlehem means? House of bread. But paradoxically, there was a great famine in that land. So Naomi and her husband left for Moab with two of their sons, Mahlon and Chilion. To make things worse, Elimelech died in Moab, and Naomi was left alone with her two sons. They married Moabite women, and to top it off, they also died. When Naomi returned to Bethlehem, her grief was so great that she asked that her name be changed to Mara, which means bitterness in Hebrew. But Naomi did not return alone. Ruth, one of her daughters-in-law, decided to return with her and become part of God's people. But when she arrived, poverty was all her fate. Why? Because Naomi could not take possession of her husband's land unless one of her husband's relatives married Ruth. One day, picking the barley ears left by the harvesters, something to which the poor and foreigners were entitled, Ruth ended up on the land of Boaz, a close relative of Elimelech. What a coincidence.
Or rather, what providence.
Exactly. Boaz was not only rich and respected, he was also a righteous man. And when he learned of Ruth's story, her loyalty, her faith, and her love for Naomi, he decided to do something unthinkable, redeeming them. That meant buying Elimelech's inheritance and taking Ruth as his wife. Did you notice? Boaz was under no obligation. No one forced him. But out of love, he became a redeemer. And what a beautiful ending. Ruth, the foreigner, the poor, the widow, ended up married to Boaz and became the great-grandmother of King David and great-great-grandmother of Jesus. Listen up, the story of Ruth is not just a romantic story, it is a prophetic parable. We, like Ruth, were foreigners, poor, without rights. But Jesus, like Boaz, redeemed us not out of duty, but out of love. He is our closest relative, our Redeemer. But there was a problem. Another close relative, he also had a right to Ruth and the land. Did you notice? Just as Boaz is symbolic of Christ, this other relative is symbolic of Satan, who also claims to have rights over us. This story is all symbolic of the great conflict. Boaz travels to Bethlehem, the elders gather, and finally, in a kind of judgment very particular to that culture, a sandal is exchanged, a symbol of ownership or belonging, and Boaz gets the right to marry Ruth and buy the land. Yes, just like Christ, Boaz is a true loving redeemer. So, in School of the Prophets 2.0, we understand that in every story, God reveals His character. And in Ruth, we are shown that God's desire is to redeem His beloved church. Let's go back to the question. Have you had hard times? Listen to the voice of God saying to you,
"Fear not, for I have redeemed you. I have called you by name. You are mine."
And second, God will shame the enemy and give us victory. Speaking of difficult times, one of the most difficult times for God's people in the Old Testament occurred in Persia in the days of Queen Esther. Do you remember the situation?
An evil man named Haman planned to destroy all the Jews.
But Queen Esther bravely intervened and saved her people.
That's right. Haman was a high official in the court of King Ahasuerus, also called Xerxes. Historian Flavius Josephus states that he was a relative of the Amalekite royal house, which would explain his deep hatred for the Jews. But the one he hated the most was Mordecai, a faithful Jew who refused to honor the proud Haman. So Haman set a date for the destruction of the Jews and had a gallows prepared for the faithful Mordecai.
And that's when Queen Esther intervened.
Exactly. Esther, whose original name was Hadassah, was the adopted daughter of Mordecai. She was actually his cousin, but he adopted her when she was orphaned by the death of her parents. King Ahasuerus fell in love with Esther because of her beauty and prudence and chose her as queen. But Esther, obeying Mordecai's advice, never said she was a Jewess. The edict, drawn up by Haman but sealed with the king's ring, gave the command to destroy, kill, and exterminate all the Jews, young and old, children and women, on one day, on the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the Adar month, and to seize their goods. The brave Esther asked all her people to pray for her. She entered the king's presence without asking permission, something that was a cause for death. The king extended his golden scepter to her, an act that granted the king's grace, and told Esther to ask for whatever she wanted, up to half the kingdom. Esther invited him to a feast along with Haman. At the feast, she invited them to another feast, and at that second gathering, she revealed to the king that she and her people were to be exterminated by the edict of the wicked Haman. It backfired on Haman because the king in his anger ordered him to be hanged on the same gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Did you notice? This is not only a wonderful story of how God protected his people in the past, but of how God will protect his people in the end time. Look how many parallelisms we find. Haman is a symbol of Lucifer, not only for being an evil enemy of God and his people, but for claiming the worship that belongs to God alone. There is a fierce persecution against God's people, just as Revelation 12 says that the dragon persecuted the woman, symbol of the church. There is a Mordecai who remains faithful to God's law and does not kneel before the enemy, symbol of the remnant who keep God's commandments and have the faith of Jesus. There is a verdict of death, as prophesied to occur in the time of the end against those who remain faithful to God's law. Esther courageously intercedes and saves her people, just as Christ intercedes and saves his beloved church. And the enemy is shamed and defeated, just as the Bible says will happen to Satan. No, it is not just a story. Esther's story is a prophecy and a guarantee of victory. Just as Harriet Tubman was back and forth to get the slaves, Ruth and Esther show us that God will also return for us. In Ruth we see that no matter how foreign, poor, or broken you are, God has already prepared your redemption out of pure love. And in Esther, we learn that even though the enemy plans our destruction, God will raise up brave men, do justice, and give us victory. What about you? What will you do with your story? It's time to believe that God can use you in these final chapters of history, as he used Ruth, as he used Esther, and as he used Harriet.
For I know the thoughts that I think toward you, thoughts of peace, and not of evil, to give you an expected end.
Has this story blessed you? You can also be part of this mission to teach the Bible in a creative and transformative way. Scan the QR code on the screen and support us so that more people can learn how to study biblical prophecy. Remember, together we can grow more.